The Arizona Territory sun hung like a merciless copper coin in the bleached sky, casting sharp shadows across the dusty courtyard of St. Catherine's Home for Children. It was the summer of 1887, and the desert heat shimmered in waves that made the distant mesas dance like mirages. Most sensible folks in Prescott stayed indoors during the scorching afternoon hours, but 12-year-old Margaret "Maggie" Sullivan had never been accused of being sensible. She knelt beside the wooden water trough behind the orphanage, her worn cotton dress already soaked with perspiration, carefully tending to a scraggly jackrabbit that had somehow gotten its hind leg caught in a makeshift snare. The rabbit's dark eyes were wide with terror, but it had stopped struggling against Maggie's gentle hands, as if it somehow understood she meant no harm. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Easy there, little one, Maggie whispered, her voice carrying the soft lilt of her Irish heritage, though she'd been born right here in Arizona Territory. Her flame-red hair caught the sunlight like burnished copper, and her green eyes held a depth of compassion that seemed far too mature for her young face. I've got you now. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore. This was Maggie Sullivan in her truest form, drawn to wounded creatures like a moth to flame, unable to pass by any living thing in distress without trying to help. It was a trait that had gotten her into more trouble than she could count during her 7 years at St. Catherine's, but it was also the very essence of who she was, Sister Mary Catherine, the stern but fair-minded woman who ran the orphanage. Often said that Maggie had been born with her heart on the outside of her chest. It was meant as both criticism and compliment criticism because Maggie's tender heart often led her into situations that disrupted the carefully ordered routine of institutional life, but compliment because in a harsh frontier world, compassion was a rare and precious gift. The rabbit's leg wasn't broken, Maggie realized with relief, just badly scraped and tangled in the crude wire snare that some thoughtless person had left behind the orphanage grounds. As she worked to free the animal, her mind wandered to the conversation she'd overheard that morning between Sister Mary Catherine and Father Miguel Rodriguez, the visiting priest from Phoenix. "The Apache raids are getting worse," Father Rodriguez had said, his voice heavy with concern. 3 homesteads attacked in the past month. The territorial governor is talking about calling in more cavalry troops from Fort Whipple. Sister Mary Catherine had sighed deeply. Those poor people, caught between fear and survival. But Father, surely not all Apache are raiders. There must be peaceful families just trying to live their lives, same as anyone else. Perhaps, Sister. But tell that to the widow Johnson, whose husband was killed last week defending their cattle. Or the Mitchell family, who lost everything when their ranch was burned. People are scared, and scared people don't always think clearly about distinctions between peaceful Indians and hostile ones. The conversation had troubled Maggie all morning. She'd grown up hearing stories about Apache warriors. Some painted them as savage monsters, others as noble defenders of their ancestral lands. But sitting here in the blazing heat, carefully freeing an injured rabbit, Maggie couldn't help but think that most living creatures were probably just trying to survive in a world that often seemed determined to hurt them. The rabbit's leg came free suddenly, and the small animal bounded away toward the mesquite bushes without so much as a backward glance. Maggie smiled despite her self-gratitude wasn't exactly common among wild animals. She was wiping her hands on her apron when she heard it, a sound that shouldn't have been there, coming from the direction of Devil's Canyon. It was barely audible over the constant whisper of desert wind, but Maggie's ears were sharper than most. Living in an orphanage taught you to listen carefully for the approach of adults who might be bringing good news or bad, for the sounds that meant someone else was in trouble, for the subtle signs that could mean the difference between safety and danger. This sound was different from anything she'd heard before. Not quite human, but not animal either. A low, rhythmic sound that seemed to carry pain and Something else. Determination, maybe. Or desperation. Maggie stood slowly, shading her eyes, with her hand as she gazed toward the rocky outcropping that marked the edge of Devil's Canyon. The sound came again, clearer this time, and her heart began to race as she realized what she was hearing. Someone was out there, someone hurt, trying to move but struggling with each step. And they were getting closer to the orphanage. Her first instinct was to run and tell Sister Mary Catherine. That would be the sensible thing, the safe thing, the thing that any well-behaved orphan girl should do when confronted with the unknown. But something held her back, perhaps the memory of the rabbit's frightened eyes, or the echo of Sister Mary Catherine's words about people just trying to live their lives. Instead, Maggie found herself walking toward the sound, her bare feet silent on the hard-packed earth. She moved with the unconscious stealth that came from years of sneaking around the orphanage grounds, investigating every noise and mystery that caught her attention. The sound was definitely coming from behind the large boulder that marked the unofficial boundary between St. Catherine's property and the wild lands beyond. As Maggie drew closer, she could make out more details: labored breathing, the scrape of something being dragged across stone, and underneath it all, what sounded almost like singing. It was a low, rhythmic chant in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow the melody seemed familiar, as if she'd heard something like it in dreams. The voice was young, probably not much older than herself, and filled with a kind of determined courage that made her chest tighten with sympathy. Maggie crept around the boulder, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure whoever was out there would hear it. What she found made her gasp and clap her hand over her mouth to muffle the sound. A boy, perhaps 13 or 14 years old, sat propped against the red rock wall of the canyon. His dark hair was matted with dust and dried blood, and his clothes, a mixture of traditional Apache garments and white man's clothing, were torn and stained. But it was his leg that made Maggie's stomach clench with sympathetic pain. A crude arrow protruded from his left thigh, and the area around the wound was swollen and discolored. The boy's face was flushed with fever, but his dark eyes burned with fierce intelligence and an unbroken spirit that reminded Maggie somehow of the wild horses that roamed the desert, beautiful, proud, and utterly untamed. He was singing softly to himself in what Maggie assumed was Apache, his voice never wavering despite the obvious agony he was enduring. In his right hand, he clutched a small leather pouch, and around his neck hung a necklace made of turquoise and silver that caught the desert light like captured sky. The boy hadn't noticed her yet, too focused on his own internal battle against pain and fever. Maggie found herself frozen, not with fear but with a kind of awed recognition. Here was another wounded creature, just like the rabbit she'd freed minutes earlier. Except this wounded creature was human, and helping him would be far more complicated than untangling wire from a jackrabbit's leg. As she watched, the boy's song faltered and his head lolled back against the rock. The leather pouch slipped from his weakening grip, spilling what looked like dried herbs and small stones onto the ground beside him. His breathing became more labored, and Maggie realized with growing alarm that he was losing consciousness. Every instinct told her to run. Apache raids, Father Rodriguez had said. People killed, homes burned. This boy could be a scout for a war party or the son of a hostile chief. Helping him could bring terrible danger to St. Catherine's, to all the children who depended on the orphanage for safety and shelter. But as these thoughts raced through her mind, Maggie found herself remembering something else: a story Sister Mary Catherine had told during one of their evening Bible lessons. The parable of the Good Samaritan, about showing mercy to a stranger, despite the risks and social boundaries that said such help was foolish or dangerous. "Who is my neighbor?" the lawyer had asked Jesus in the story. And Jesus had answered with a tale about choosing compassion over convenience, about seeing past differences to recognize shared humanity. The boy's breathing grew more shallow, and Maggie made her decision. She stepped out from behind her concealment, her hands raised to show she meant no harm. The movement caught the boy's attention, and his eyes snapped open, instantly alert despite his weakened condition. His hand moved toward a knife at his belt, but the motion was slow and unsteady. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the space of a few feet that might as well have been an ocean. A white orphan girl and an Apache boy, representatives of two peoples who were supposedly enemies, measuring each other's intentions in the merciless Arizona heat. Then Maggie did something that surprised them both. She knelt down and began gathering up the scattered contents of his medicine pouch, her movements slow and deliberate to show she understood their importance. When she'd collected everything, she held the pouch out to him, never taking her eyes from his face. The boy's expression shifted from wariness to confusion to something that might have been hope. He accepted the pouch with trembling hands, his fingers briefly touching hers in the exchange. His skin was burning with fever, and up close Maggie could see that his condition was far worse than she'd initially realized. "Water," she said simply, miming the action of drinking. "You need water." The boy nodded weakly, understanding crossing his features despite the language barrier. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. It was a small, pained smile, but genuine nonetheless, transforming his face from that of a fierce young warrior to what he really was, a frightened, hurt child, far from home and in desperate need of help. "Wait here," Maggie whispered, though she knew he probably couldn't understand her words. She pointed to herself, then to him, then back toward the orphanage, trying to communicate that she would return. As she hurried back toward St. Catherine's, her mind raced with the implications of what she'd just committed herself to. She was about to ask Sister Mary Catherine to harbor an Apache boy during a time when Apache raids had the entire territory on edge. She was about to turn the orphanage into a potential target for both hostile Apache, who might come looking for their missing member, and angry white settlers who might view any assistance to Indians as treason. But she was also about to save a life. And somehow, in the blazing heat of that Arizona afternoon, with the memory of the boy's grateful smile fresh in her mind, that seemed like the only thing that really mattered. The wounded rabbit she'd freed earlier darted across her path. As she approached the orphanage's back door, disappearing into the desert scrub as if it had never been hurt at all, Maggie took it as a sign that sometimes taking a risk to help a wounded creature was exactly the right thing to do. Regardless of what others might think, she paused at the door, her hand on the worn wooden handle, knowing that once she crossed this threshold and spoke what she'd found, there would be no going back. The safe, predictable routine of orphanage life would be shattered, replaced by uncertainty and danger, and the kind of complications that arose when people chose conscience over comfort. But then she thought of the boy's fevered breathing, of the arrow in his leg, of the trust in his eyes when he'd accepted his medicine pouch from her hands. And she knew that some choices weren't really choices at all. They were simply the inevitable result of being the kind of person who couldn't walk away from suffering. No matter what form it took, Maggie Sullivan opened the door and stepped into the cool darkness of St. Catherine's Home for Children, carrying with her the news that would change everything for everyone within its walls. She didn't know it yet, but this single act of compassion would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge every assumption the Arizona territory held about friendship and enmity, about the difference between civilization and savagery, and about the power of a child's simple kindness to bridge divides that adults considered unbridgeable. The boy in Devil's Canyon was dying, and Maggie Sullivan was about to discover just how far she was willing to go to save a life that others would consider worthless, or worse, dangerous. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sister Mary Catherine was in the kitchen preparing the evening meal when Maggie burst through the back door, her face flushed from the heat, and something else, an urgency that immediately caught the nun's attention. The older woman had run St. Catherine's Home for Children for nearly 15 years, and she'd learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished ordinary childhood excitement from genuine crisis. "Sister," Maggie gasped, still catching her breath, "there's someone hurt, badly hurt, out by Devil's Canyon." Sister Mary Catherine set down the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir a pot of beans and turned to face Maggie fully. She was a woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair beneath her white wimple and eyes the color of winter sky. Her face bore the lines that came from years of caring for orphan children in a harsh frontier territory, but those same lines spoke of countless acts of kindness and protection. "Slow down, child," Sister Mary Catherine said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had soothed hundreds of frightened children over the years. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Maggie took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. "It's a boy, sister, about my age, maybe a little older. He's been shot with an arrow, and he's burning up with fever. He's going to die if we don't help him." Sister Mary Catherine's expression grew more serious. "A boy? What was he doing near Devil's Canyon? Is he from town?" This was the moment Maggie had been dreading, but she forced herself to meet the nun's eyes directly. "No, sister, he's Apache." The kitchen fell silent except for the bubbling of the bean pot and the distant sounds of other children playing in the courtyard. Sister Mary Catherine's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, concern, and what might have been fear before settling into thoughtful consideration. "Apache," she repeated quietly, as if testing the word. "Are you certain, Maggie?" "Yes." "Sister, his clothes, his hair, the way he was singing. It was Apache words, I'm sure of it." Maggie's voice grew stronger as she continued. "But sister, he's just a boy, and he's hurt so badly. The arrow is still in his leg, and there's infection setting in. I could see it in the swelling, the way his skin looked." Sister Mary Catherine moved to the window that faced Devil's Canyon, her mind clearly working through the implications of Maggie's discovery. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desert floor, and in the distance, the rocky outcroppings looked more ominous than usual. "Maggie," she said finally, "you understand what you're asking? With the raids that have been happening, with people's fear running so high, harboring an Apache boy could bring terrible danger to this place, to all the children here." "I know," Maggie said quietly. "But sister, remember what you taught us about the Good Samaritan? About how Jesus said to love our neighbors? Well, that boy is my neighbor now, and he's going to die if someone doesn't help him." The nun turned from the window, and Maggie was surprised to see something that might have been pride in her eyes alongside the worry. "You understand that if we do this, if we bring him here, there's no guarantee we can keep it secret? And if word gets out, then we'll face whatever comes," Maggie said with a determination that surprised them both. "But sister," I looked into his eyes, "he's not a monster or a savage. He's just a scared, hurt boy who needs help." Sister Mary Catherine was quiet for a long moment, and Maggie could practically see the internal battle being fought. Finally, the nun sighed deeply and removed her apron. "Show me," she said simply. They gathered supplies quickly and quietly cleaned bandages, carbolic acid for disinfection, laudanum for pain, and a stretcher that was usually used for moving heavy supplies. Sister Mary Catherine also collected her medical kit, assembled over years of treating everything from childhood illnesses to serious injuries among the orphanage population. "We tell no one else for now," Sister Mary Catherine instructed as they made their way toward Devil's Canyon. "Not until we understand the full situation." As they approached the boulder where Maggie had left the boy, she felt her stomach clench with worry. What if he died while she was gone? What if other Apache had found him and taken him away? What if soldiers had discovered him? But as they rounded the massive stone, the boy was still there, though his condition had clearly worsened. His breathing was more labored, and he seemed only semi-conscious, mumbling words in Apache while his head tossed restlessly against the rock. Sister Mary. Catherine's intake of breath was sharp as she took in the full extent of his injuries. Up close, the arrow wound was clearly serious. The shaft had penetrated deep into the muscle of his thigh, and the surrounding tissue was badly inflamed. But there were other injuries too, ones that Maggie hadn't been able to see from her earlier vantage point. Scratches and cuts covered the boy's arms and torso, suggesting he'd fought his way through thick brush or rocky terrain. His clothes were torn in patterns that spoke of desperate flight rather than normal travel. Most disturbing of all, there were rope burns around his wrists, raw and recent. Sweet Mary and Joseph, Sister Mary Catherine whispered, her medical training immediately assessing the various wounds. This child has been through hell. She knelt beside the boy and gently touched his forehead, checking his temperature. His eyes fluttered open at the contact, and he tried to pull away, fear flashing across his fevered features. Easy, son, Sister Mary Catherine said softly, her voice taking on the same gentle tone she used with frightened children. We're here to help. The boy's gaze moved between the nun and Maggie, confusion evident in his dark eyes. He said something in Apache, his voice barely above a whisper, and pointed weakly toward the mountains. I think he's trying to tell us something, Maggie said, kneeling on the boy's other side. Something about where he came from, maybe. Sister Mary Catherine began examining the arrow wound more closely, her face growing grimmer as she assessed the damage. This wasn't done by accident, she said quietly. Look at the angle, the depth. Someone shot this boy at close range while he was running. The implications of her words hung heavy in the desert air. This wasn't a casualty of some distant raid or battle. This was a child who had been deliberately hunted and shot, then somehow managed to escape and make his way to their doorstep. Sister, Maggie said, her voice tight with emotion, those rope burns on his wrists. I see them. Sister Mary Catherine's tone was grim. This boy was a prisoner, and somehow he escaped. The question is, prisoner of whom? As if in response to their questions, the boy struggled to sit up straighter and managed to speak a few words in heavily accented English. Soldiers. Men. Took family. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. This wasn't an Apache raider who had been wounded in an attack on white settlers. This was a victim, possibly the only survivor, of an attack on his own people. Can you tell us your name? Sister Mary Catherine asked gently, speaking slowly and clearly. The boy looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust these strangers with even that basic information. Finally he spoke. Joseph. Joseph Crowfeather. The fact that he had an English name alongside what was clearly an Apache name suggested a complex background. Perhaps he'd spent time at one of the reservation schools, or had family connections to white settlements. Joseph, Sister Mary Catherine repeated, her voice warm with compassion. My name is Sister Mary Catherine, and this is Maggie. We want to help you, but first we need to get that arrow out and treat your wounds. Do you understand? Joseph nodded weakly, then said something more in Apache before switching back to broken English. You take me. Soldiers find you. Dangerous for for children. Even in his fevered, weakened state, he was trying to protect them. The realization struck Maggie like a thunderbolt. This boy, who had every reason to hate and distrust white people, after whatever he'd endured, was more concerned about their safety than his own. Let us worry about that, Sister Mary Catherine said firmly. Right now you need medical attention, and we're going to make sure you get it. As they carefully maneuvered Joseph onto the stretcher, Maggie caught glimpses of the full extent of his ordeal. There were old scars mixed with fresh wounds, suggesting this wasn't the first time he'd faced violence. His moccasins were worn through in places, indicating he'd traveled a great distance on foot. Most tellingly, his eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of horrors witnessed and trauma endured. The journey back to the orphanage was tense, with Sister Mary Catherine and Maggie constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. They brought Joseph through the back entrance, avoiding the main areas where other children might see them, and settled him in a small storage room that Sister Mary Catherine quickly converted into a makeshift medical facility. As the nun began the delicate process of removing the arrow, Joseph gripped Maggie's hand with surprising strength for someone in his condition. Through gritted teeth, he managed to share fragments of his story. My family. We live peaceful, grow corn, tend horses. Then soldiers come, not regular army. Bad men with badges. Say we steal cattle. Not true. We have papers, permission to be there. Sister Mary Catherine worked carefully, her years of frontier medical experience guiding her hands as she extracted the arrowhead and cleaned the wound. Joseph continued his halting narrative, pausing frequently as waves of pain washed over him. They take my father, my uncle. Rope around hands. My mother, she fight. They hit her. His voice broke slightly. I try to help, but too small. They tie me too, say make example of Apache thieves. The picture that emerged was horrifying. A peaceful Apache family, apparently living legally on designated land, had been attacked by what sounded like vigilantes or corrupt officials looking for scapegoats to blame for recent cattle thefts. I escape when they stop to water horses, Joseph continued. Cut ropes on sharp rock. They chase me, shoot arrows when bullets run out. I hide in canyon for 2 days before you find me. As Sister Mary Catherine finished treating the wound and began bandaging it, she and Maggie exchanged meaningful looks. They now understood that they weren't just harboring a wounded boy. They were protecting the sole survivor of what amounted to a massacre, and quite possibly the only witness to crimes that some very dangerous people would kill to keep secret. Joseph, Sister Mary Catherine said gently as she completed her medical work. Do you know who these men were? Did you recognize any of them? Joseph's eyes grew hard despite his youth and weakness. The leader. He wear badge, say he deputy sheriff. Big man with yellow mustache and scar on face. He call himself Morrison, Deputy Morrison. The name meant nothing to Maggie, but she saw Sister Mary Catherine's face pale slightly. In a small territory like Arizona, law enforcement officials were generally known by reputation, if not personally. If this Morrison was a real deputy, then Joseph's presence at the orphanage represented even greater danger than they'd initially realized. Rest now, Sister Mary Catherine said, pulling a blanket up to Joseph's chin. We'll figure out what to do next. As they left the makeshift sick room, Maggie felt the full weight of what they'd taken on settling over her. They weren't just hiding an Apache boy anymore. They were harboring a witness to what appeared to be an officially sanctioned atrocity. And somewhere out there, dangerous men with badges and authority were probably still looking for the one person who could expose their crimes. But as she thought about Joseph's grateful smile when she'd returned his medicine pouch about the way he'd worried for their safety even while dying from his own wounds, Maggie knew they'd made the right choice. Some actions were right not because they were safe or easy, but because they were necessary. The real question now was, how long could they keep Joseph's presence secret? And what would happen when the outside world inevitably discovered what St. Catherine's Home for Children had done? 3 days passed before Joseph Crowfeather was strong enough to tell his full story. During those tense hours, Sister Mary Catherine had maintained a careful routine checking his wounds, monitoring his fever, and ensuring that none of the other children at St. Catherine's discovered their secret guest. Maggie had become Joseph's unofficial guardian, bringing him meals and sitting with him during the long desert nights when fever dreams made him cry out in Apache. It was on the 4th morning, as the first pale light of dawn crept through the small window of the storage room, that Joseph finally felt ready to share the complete truth about what had brought him to their doorstep. Sister Mary Catherine sat in a wooden chair beside his makeshift bed, while Maggie perched cross-legged. On the floor, her green eyes fixed intently on his face. "My story begins long before the soldiers came," Joseph said, his voice still weak but growing stronger each day. "My grandfather, Running Bear, was a chief who believed in the white man's promises. When I was small boy, maybe 6 summers, the Indian agent came to our village. He spoke of peace, of land where Apache could live safely if we agreed to boundaries." Joseph's dark eyes grew distant as he remembered those earlier times. "My grandfather signed the papers, made his mark on the white man's treaty. We moved our people to the valley. They showed us good land with water and grass for horses. The agent, his name was Thomas Wheeler, he seemed like honest man. He said if we stayed peaceful, grew crops like white farmers, sent children to learn English, we would be protected." Sister Mary Catherine leaned forward slightly. "This was the reservation." "Land? Not reservation like the big ones," Joseph clarified. "Smaller place, what they called settlement area. We were supposed to be what his word ... demonstrating. Showing other Apache that white man's way could work alongside Apache ways." Maggie found herself fascinated by this glimpse into a world. She'd never imagined Apache families trying to bridge 2 cultures, attempting to find peace through compromise and adaptation. "My father, Standing Elk, he was chosen to be spokesman for our group because he learned English well at the mission school in Santa Fe. My mother, Blue Morning Star, she learned to grow vegetables in the white woman's way, with rows and fences. We had 40 people in our settlement, families with children, old ones with wisdom, young warriors who chose peace over war." Joseph's voice grew softer as he spoke of his family, and Maggie could see both love and loss in his expression. "For 3 years, it worked. We grew corn and squash, raised horses, traded with white ranchers nearby. My little sister, Dancing Water, she was born in the 2nd year. She learned Apache songs from grandmother and English words from mission teacher who came monthly." "It sounds almost like paradise," Sister Mary Catherine observed gently. Joseph's expression darkened. "Paradise with shadows. Even in good times, some white settlers looked at us with suspicion. They said Apache land was too good for savages, that we should be on reservation with rest of our people. Other Apache said we were traitors, becoming white man's pets instead of fighting for our freedom." He shifted uncomfortably on his bedding, and Maggie noticed him unconsciously rubbing the rope scars on his wrists. "But we believed in Agent Wheeler's promises. We believed that if we proved ourselves, more Apache could live in peace. My father even helped catch Apache raiders who stole cattle from nearby ranches. He thought this would show our loyalty. What changed?" Maggie asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer would be heartbreaking. "Agent Wheeler died last winter. Fever took him in 2 days." Joseph's voice became flat, emotionless in the way of someone recounting trauma. "The new agent, man named Harrison Blackwood, he was different. First time he came to our settlement. He looked around like he was measuring everything for sale." Sister Mary Catherine's expression grew grim. She'd seen enough of territorial politics to understand where this story was heading. "Blackwood brought different papers," Joseph continued. "Said previous agreement was temporary arrangement, that needed ... updating. New treaty would move us to reservation near Fort Apache, give our valley land to white homesteaders. My father asked to see Agent Wheeler's original papers, but Blackwood said they were lost in office fire. The lies were so transparent that even a child could see through them. But Joseph's family had been trapped by their very success in adapting to white ways. They'd invested 3 years in building a life according to white man's rules, only to discover that those rules could be changed at any moment to benefit others. My father refused to sign new papers," Joseph said with quiet pride. "He said we had honor agreement, that Wheeler's word was good even if Wheeler was dead. Blackwood left angry, but we thought law would protect us. Maggie felt her heart sinking as she realized how naive Joseph's father had been to trust in legal protections for Apache people in Arizona territory. 2 weeks later, cattle started disappearing from nearby ranches. Joseph continued, his voice growing harder. Every time cows went missing, someone whispered that Apache settlement was involved. Never any proof, never any tracks leading to our village, but whispers grew louder. Sister Mary Catherine nodded grimly. Classic territorial tactics. Create suspicion, then use that suspicion to justify whatever action you wanted to take anyway. Then, 3 days ago, Deputy Morrison came with 5 men. They had badges, looked official, but Joseph paused, struggling with painful memories. But their eyes were wrong. Like men who enjoy hurting others. He took a shaky breath before continuing. Morrison said they had reports of stolen cattle. Hidden in our village. My father showed him around, let them search everywhere. No cattle, of course, but Morrison said we must have moved them. Said we were under arrest for theft and conspiracy. The injustice of it made Maggie's hands clench into fists. But if they couldn't find any evidence doesn't matter when you have badges and guns, Joseph replied with bitter wisdom beyond his years. They tied up all the men first, my father, my uncle Swift Eagle, my grandfather Running Bear, even boy cousins barely old enough to hunt. Said we were dangerous criminals who needed to be transported to territorial prison. Sister Mary Catherine's face had gone pale. What about the women and children? Joseph's voice broke slightly as he answered. Morrison said they would be relocated to proper reservation. But the way he looked at my mother, at the other women, we all knew it was lie. Bad men with badges could do anything to Apache women and children. And who would believe our word against theirs? The horrible implications hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. In the lawless territories, corrupt officials could commit virtually any atrocity against Native Americans with little fear of consequences. My mother tried to run to me when they tied my hands, Joseph continued, tears now flowing openly down his cheeks. Morrison hit her with rifle butt, knocked her down. She hit her head on rockin', and there was blood, so much blood. Maggie reached out and took Joseph's hand, offering what comfort she could as he relived the worst moments of his young life. That's when I went crazy with rage, he said. Tried to attack Morrison even with hands tied. He laughed, said young Apache needed to learn respect for white authority. That's when he shot the arrow into my leg, not to kill, but to cripple me so I couldn't run. Sister Mary Catherine's medical training made her wince at the calculated cruelty of using an arrow instead of a bullet. An arrow would cause maximum pain while keeping the victim alive and mobile enough to walk. They made us watch while they burned our homes, Joseph said, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years of building, 3 years of peace, gone in one afternoon. Morrison said it was lesson for any Apache who thought they could live among white people as equals. The systematic destruction wasn't just about removing unwanted neighbors. It was about sending a message to other Apache communities that cooperation and assimilation would be rewarded with betrayal and violence. They started marching us toward the mountains, Joseph continued. Said there was mine where Apache criminals could work off their debt to society. But I heard Morrison talking to his men when they thought no one was listening. There was no mine, no prison. They planned to kill us all in the desert and claim we died trying to escape. Maggie felt sick as she realized the full scope of the planned atrocity. This wasn't just theft of land or corruption. It was genocide disguised as law enforcement. How did you escape? Sister Mary Catherine asked gently. Joseph managed a small, grim smile. Apache children learned to be resourceful. During second day of March, they stopped to water horses at Desert Spring. I had worked my ropes loose against sharp rock. They made me carry punishment for trying to fight Morrison. When guard fell asleep, I slipped away. But the arrow in your leg. Pain was nothing compared to knowing my family would die if I didn't get help. Joseph's voice carried the steel of a young man who'd been forced to grow up too quickly. I crawled through brush, used animal paths, traveled only at night. Morrison's men tracked me for day and half, but Desert is my friend and they were stupid. White men who made too much noise. Sister Mary Catherine leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the injustice Joseph had described. "Do you have any idea what happened to your family after you escaped?" Joseph's expression grew haunted. "I don't know. Morrison was very angry when he realized I was gone. If my family is still alive, it's only because he wants to use them as bait to draw me back." The weight of responsibility settled over the small room like a suffocating blanket. Joseph wasn't just a wounded boy seeking refuge. He was the sole witness to a planned massacre, and quite possibly the only hope his family had for rescue. "Joseph," Maggie said carefully, "do you think your people, other Apache, would believe your story? Would they help if they knew what Morrison was planning?" Joseph considered this for a long moment. "My grandfather's brother, Chief Gray Wolf, leads band of warriors in the mountains south of here. He never trusted white man's promises, always said peace treaties were lies. If he knew what happened to our settlement—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Gray Wolf's warriors would not respond to news of the massacre with forgiveness or legal appeals. They would respond with the kind of vengeance that would give territorial authorities all the excuse they needed to launch a full-scale war against Apache people. "There has to be another way," Sister Mary Catherine said firmly. "Some legal authority we can appeal to, someone in the territorial government who isn't corrupt." Joseph looked at her with the sad wisdom of someone who'd learned not to trust injustice. "Sister, you are a good woman with kind heart. But in Arizona territory, Apache word means nothing against white man's badge. Even if honest officials exist, who will believe story of Indian boy against respected deputy sheriff?" The truth of his words was undeniable, but Maggie refused to accept defeat. "Then we make them believe," she said with sudden determination. "We find proof, gather evidence, force them to see the truth." Both Sister Mary Catherine and Joseph stared at her, surprised by the fierce resolve in her young voice. "Maggie, sister," Mary Catherine said gently, "what you're suggesting is incredibly dangerous. If Morrison discovers that Joseph is alive and talking, then we better make sure our evidence reaches the right people before Morrison finds us," Maggie replied. "Joseph, you said your father kept papers from Agent Wheeler, documents proving your legal right to the settlement land?" Joseph nodded slowly. "Hidden in special place my grandfather showed me. Waterproof pouch buried near the spring where sacred ceremonies were held. If papers survive the burning, then that's where we start," Maggie declared. "We recover those documents, find honest authorities, and make sure Morrison and his men face justice for what they've done." Sister Mary Catherine looked between the determined 12-year-old girl and the wounded Apache boy, seeing in both of them a courage that humbled her. "You understand what you're proposing? Going back to the settlement site, searching through the aftermath of massacre, risking capture by men who've already proven they'll kill to protect their secrets?" "I understand," Maggie said simply. "But I also understand that some things are worth the risk. Justice is worth the risk. Joseph's family is worth the risk." Joseph studied Maggie's face for a long moment, then spoke with quiet conviction. If white girl with red hair is brave enough to fight for Apache justice, then Apache boy must be brave enough to help her. And in that moment, an unlikely alliance was forged: an orphaned Irish girl, a Catholic nun, and a wounded Apache boy, united by their shared belief that some wrongs were too great to ignore, some injustices too clear to let stand unchallenged. The question now was whether their combined courage would be enough to overcome the forces arrayed against them, and whether justice could prevail in a territory where badges and bullets too often determined right from wrong, While Joseph recovered his strength over the following week, an unexpected transformation began taking place within the walls of St. Catherine's Home for Children. What had started as a desperate act of compassion was evolving into something far more complex, a delicate network of trust, friendship, and shared purpose that would soon be tested in ways none of them could have anticipated. The first challenge came from an unexpected source: 8-year-old Timothy Fletcher, the newest arrival at the orphanage. Timothy had lost his parents in an Apache raid just 3 months earlier, and his hatred for anything Apache was absolute and consuming. He'd been having nightmares since his arrival, often waking the other children with his terrified screams about savage painted faces and bloodthirsty warriors. It was Timothy who first noticed that something was different about Maggie's routine. She'd always been the type to help with extra chores and spend time in quiet corners of the orphanage, but now she was disappearing for longer periods, carrying food that wasn't meant for the regular meals and speaking in hushed whispers with Sister Mary Catherine. "Maggie's hiding something," Timothy announced to the other children during their afternoon study period. "She's been sneaking around for days, acting all secretive." Sarah Wilson, a practical 14-year-old who served as an unofficial leader among the older children, looked up from her arithmetic slate. "Maybe she's planning something nice for Sister Mary Catherine's birthday next month." But Timothy shook his head stubbornly. "It's not that. Yesterday I saw her taking bandages from the medical supplies. And this morning, she was carrying a bowl of that special broth Sister makes when someone's really sick." The other children began paying closer attention to Maggie's movements, and it became increasingly difficult to maintain the secret. Sister Mary Catherine realized they needed a different approach, one that would protect Joseph while also addressing the growing curiosity and suspicion within their small community. "We need to tell them something," Sister Mary Catherine said to Maggie as they prepared Joseph's evening meal in the kitchen. "Timothy's getting more suspicious every day, and if he starts making accusations, ... But what can we tell them?" Maggie asked, ladling soup into a bowl. Timothy would probably try to attack Joseph if he knew the truth. Joseph, who had been strong enough to sit up and take short walks around the storage room, had overheard enough conversations to understand the dilemma his presence was creating. When Maggie brought his meal that evening, he had a proposal. "Maybe it's time for me to meet the other children," he said quietly. "Not as a Apache boy who needs hiding, but as, what do you call it, fellow orphan who needs help." Sister Mary Catherine, who had accompanied Maggie on the evening visit, looked skeptical. "Joseph, you understand the risk. Timothy Fletcher's parents were killed in a raid. His reaction could be volatile." Joseph nodded solemnly. "I understand. But hiding makes me seem dangerous, like wild animal in cage. If children meet me as person, maybe fear becomes different understanding." It was Maggie who came up with the plan. The next afternoon, during the children's free time, she approached Timothy Fletcher directly. "Timothy," she said, settling beside him on the wooden steps of the main building, "how would you feel about helping someone who's been hurt really badly?" Timothy looked suspicious immediately. "What kind of helping, and who's hurt?" "Someone who lost his family, just like you did. Someone who's been through terrible things and needs friends to help him heal." The parallel to his own situation wasn't lost on Timothy, but his expression remained guarded. "Where is this person? Is that why you've been acting so strange?" Before Maggie could answer, Sister Mary Catherine appeared with Joseph walking slowly beside her. Joseph had insisted on wearing some of the orphanage's donated clothes rather than his traditional Apache garments, hoping to appear less threatening. But his dark hair, bronze skin, and the careful way he moved due to his healing leg wound immediately marked him as different. Timothy's reaction was instantaneous and explosive. He leaped to his feet, his face going white with terror and rage. "Apache!" he screamed, pointing at Joseph with a trembling finger. "There's an Apache here." The other children came running from various corners of the courtyard, drawn by Timothy's panicked shouts. Within moments, Joseph found himself surrounded by a dozen pairs of eyes, some curious, some frightened, some openly hostile. "Everyone calm down," Sister Mary Catherine said firmly, moving to stand between Joseph and the agitated children. "I want you all to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you." But Timothy wasn't interested in listening. His young face was twisted with the kind of hatred that comes from deep trauma. "You're harboring the enemy," he shouted at Sister Mary Catherine. "They killed my parents, they burned our house, and now you're letting one of them live here with us." Joseph stepped forward despite Sister Mary Catherine's protective gesture. When he spoke, his voice was calm and clear, with only the slightest trace of an accent. "My name is Joseph," he said simply, "and I am not your enemy." The use of perfect English startled several of the children, who had expected guttural war cries or incomprehensible Apache words. Timothy, however, was not deterred. "You're lying," he accused. "Apache don't have regular names, and they don't speak like normal people." "Timothy," Sister Mary Catherine said sharply, "that's enough. Joseph is a guest in our home, and he will be treated with respect." But Joseph raised his hand gently. "Please, sister, let me answer." He turned to address Timothy directly, his dark eyes serious but kind. "Timothy Fletcher, I know about your parents. I know about the raid that destroyed your home, and I am very, very sorry for your loss." The unexpected condolence, delivered with genuine compassion, took some of the wind out of Timothy's anger. He stared at Joseph in confusion, clearly struggling to reconcile his image of Apache as mindless savages with this soft-spoken boy who knew his name and acknowledged his pain. "How do you know about my parents?" Timothy asked, his voice still hostile but no longer screaming. "Because the same kind of evil men who killed your family also killed mine," Joseph replied quietly. 3 days ago, corrupt sheriff's deputies attacked my village. They murdered my grandfather, my aunts and uncles, probably my parents and little sister too. I escaped, but just barely. Sarah Wilson, the practical 14-year-old, stepped forward with the directness that had made her a natural leader. "You're saying white men killed your family?" Joseph nodded. "Bad white men with badges and guns. Men who wanted our land and didn't care how they got it." The revelation created a ripple of confusion among the children. Their understanding of frontier conflicts was simple. Apache raided white settlements, white soldiers and settlers defended themselves. The idea that white authority figures might be the aggressors was difficult to process. Double quotes, but ... Timothy struggled with the contradiction. "But Apache are the ones who raid and kill. Everyone knows that." "Some Apache do raid," Joseph acknowledged honestly. "Just like some white men murder and steal. But not all Apache are raiders, just like not all white men are murderers." Sister Mary Catherine seized the moment to provide context. "Children, Joseph's family lived peacefully for 3 years on land they were legally allowed to settle. They grew crops, raised horses, and never bothered anyone. They were attacked because corrupt men wanted their land." 10-year-old Michael O'Connor, whose Irish accent was even stronger than Maggie's, spoke up uncertainly. "So you're saying Apache can be ... good?" "I'm saying Apache are people," Joseph replied. "Some good, some bad, most somewhere in between. Just like any people." The philosophical discussion might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Father Francisco Valdez, the traveling priest who served the scattered Catholic communities throughout the territory, came riding up the dusty path to St. Catherine's front gate. Father Valdez was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and eyes that had seen enough of frontier life to be shocked by very little. He was also, unfortunately, someone who was likely to ask difficult questions about any unusual activities at the orphanage. "Sister Mary Catherine," he called out as he dismounted from his horse. I bring news from Prescott, and I'm afraid it's troubling news. Sister Mary Catherine quickly moved to intercept him before he could notice Joseph among the gathered children. Father Valdez, what a pleasant surprise. What brings you to St. Catherine's today? Deputy Morrison has been asking questions in town, Father Valdez said, his voice carrying concern. He claims there's a dangerous Apache fugitive in the area, possibly hiding among sympathetic whites. He's been given authority to search any building or property where the fugitive might be concealed. The blood drained from Sister Mary Catherine's face, but she managed to keep her voice steady. I see. And when might we expect this? Search? That's just it, sister. Morrison could arrive at any time. He's not bothering with warrants or official procedures. Territorial governor has given him broad emergency powers to deal with what he's calling Apache terrorist threat. Behind Sister Mary Catherine, the children had gone quiet, instinctively understanding that they were overhearing something important and dangerous. Joseph's face had gone pale, but he remained perfectly still, not wanting to draw attention to himself. Father, Sister Mary Catherine said carefully, what exactly is this fugitive accused of? Murder, arson, cattle theft, the usual charges when they want someone badly enough. Father Valdez replied grimly. But Morrison seems unusually determined to capture this particular individual. He's offering a substantial reward for information leading to the fugitive's capture. The priest's eyes swept over the assembled children, and for a heart-stopping moment, his gaze lingered on Joseph. But then he looked away without recognition, apparently seeing only another orphan among many. I wanted to warn you, sister, because Morrison has a reputation for thoroughness. If he searches St. Catherine's, he may disrupt your routine considerably. Perhaps the children should be prepared for the possibility of unexpected visitors. Thank you for the warning, Father, Sister Mary Catherine managed. We'll certainly keep that in mind. After Father Valdez left, promising to return the following week for regular services, the courtyard fell into tense silence. The children looked between Sister Mary Catherine, Maggie, and Joseph. Beginning to understand the gravity of the situation, they'd all become part of Dot. It was Timothy Fletcher who broke the silence, his voice small and confused. Sister, are you going to hide him, even though it might get us all in trouble? Sister Mary Catherine looked at the boy who had lost his parents to Apache raiders, now asking whether she would risk everything to protect an Apache child. Timothy, what do you think we should do? Timothy studied Joseph's face for a long moment, clearly wrestling with emotions and beliefs that had been turned upside down in the space of an hour. Finally, he spoke with the simple honesty of childhood. I still don't like Apache, he said quietly. They killed my parents, and I don't think I can ever forgive that. But he paused, looking directly at Joseph. But you didn't kill my parents. And if bad white men killed your family, then maybe you're not my enemy, Joseph nodded solemnly. I understand your anger, Timothy Fletcher. If Apache had killed my family, I would feel the same about white people. But maybe we can both choose to see each other as people who have suffered, instead of people who should suffer more. The wisdom in Joseph's words, coming from someone barely older than Timothy himself, seemed to resonate with all the children. Even those who had initially been frightened or hostile began to see him differently, not as a symbol of everything they'd been taught to fear, but as another orphan child who needed help and friendship. Sarah Wilson, ever practical, was the first to address the immediate problem. So what do we do when this Deputy Morrison shows up? We can't exactly hide Joseph in the storage room if they're going to search the whole building. We'll figure something out, Maggie said with more confidence than she felt. We have to. But even as she spoke, she could see the wheels turning in Joseph's mind. He was already planning something, and she had a sinking feeling that his plan would involve sacrificing himself to protect the orphanage and everyone in it. The bonds between the children of St. Catherine's were growing stronger. by the hour, forged in the crucible of shared danger and moral complexity. But time was running out, and somewhere in the desert, Deputy Morrison was closing in on the one person who could expose his crimes, or die trying to protect the innocents who had shown him mercy. The real test of their newfound unity was about to begin. The morning after Father Valdez's warning brought an unexpected ally to St. Catherine's doorstep, Dr. Benjamin Carter, the territory's circuit physician who visited the orphanage monthly to check on the children's health, arrived earlier than scheduled with news that would change everything. Dr. Carter was a tall, lean man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair and the steady hands of someone who'd performed surgery by lamplight in frontier conditions more times than he cared to count. Unlike many territorial officials, he'd earned his position through competence rather than connections, and his reputation for integrity was unquestioned throughout Arizona territory. "Sister Mary Catherine," he said as he dismounted from his horse, "I need to speak with you privately. I've heard some disturbing reports from Prescott that concern me greatly." Sister Mary Catherine's heart raced, but she maintained her composure as she led Dr. Carter into the orphanage's small office. Through the window, she could see Maggie helping Joseph with his morning walk around the courtyard, his leg growing stronger each day, but still requiring careful movement. "Doctor, what brings you here so urgently?" Dr. Carter removed his hat and ran his fingers through his gray hair. A gesture she'd learned indicated he was troubled by something serious. "Sister, I've been practicing medicine in this territory for 20 years. I've treated Apache, Mexican, and white patients alike, and I've learned to recognize the signs of systematic violence versus random frontier conflicts." He paused, studying her face carefully. "Yesterday, a Mexican trader brought 3 badly injured Apache to my clinic in Prescott. 2 women and an elderly man, all suffering from gunshot wounds and severe beatings. The trader found them half dead in the desert near what used to be a peaceful Apache settlement." Sister Mary Catherine felt her mouth go dry, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I see. And what did these patients tell you about their injuries?" "That's just it, sister. They're too traumatized to speak coherently. But their injuries tell a story that contradicts everything Deputy Morrison has been reporting about Apache raids and criminal activity." Dr. Carter leaned forward in his chair. "These people weren't wounded in combat or while committing crimes. They were tortured." The word hung in the air between them like an accusation. Sister Mary Catherine knew she was at a crossroads. She could maintain their secret and hope Dr. Carter would leave without discovering Joseph, or she could trust in his reputation for integrity and moral courage. "Doctor," she said quietly, "hypothetically speaking, if someone had witnessed the events that led to those injuries, someone who could provide testimony about what really happened, would that person be safe from retaliation?" Dr. Carter's eyes sharpened with interest. "That would depend on who was doing the retaliating and how much evidence this hypothetical witness could provide. But sister, if you're asking whether I believe Deputy Morrison is capable of murdering witnesses to cover up his crimes, the answer is absolutely yes." The blunt assessment confirmed Sister Mary Catherine's worst fears, but it also told her that Dr. Carter was already suspicious of Morrison's activities. She made her decision. "Doctor, I need you to understand that what I'm about to show you puts not just myself, but every child in this orphanage at risk. But I believe you're a man who values truth over convenience." She led him to the storage room where Joseph was resting between his morning exercises. When Dr. Carter saw the young Apache boy, his medical instincts immediately took over. "Good Lord," he breathed, noting the careful bandaging around Joseph's leg and the lingering signs of trauma in the boy's posture. "You're the survivor they've been hunting." Joseph looked up at the older man with a mixture of wariness and hope. "You are doctor?" "Real doctor who helps Apache people." "I'm a doctor who helps people, regardless of their ancestry," Dr. Carter replied firmly. "May I examine?" Your wound? I want to understand the full extent of what was done to you. As Dr. Carter conducted his examination, Joseph told his story once again, this time with the precision that came from having to repeat traumatic events multiple times. The doctor's face grew increasingly grim as he documented the evidence of systematic torture and attempted murder. This arrow wound was deliberately non-fatal, Dr. Carter concluded, his voice tight with controlled anger. Whoever shot you knew exactly how to cause maximum pain while keeping you mobile. That level of calculated cruelty suggests someone with experience in interrogation and torture. Morrison said he learned from Army interrogators during Indian wars, Joseph confirmed. He liked making people hurt while keeping them alive to hurt more. Dr. Carter finished his examination and sat back, his expression thoughtful. Joseph, the 3 Apache I'm treating in Prescott, can you describe your family members for me? Hope flared in Joseph's eyes as he described his mother, aunt, and grandfather. Dr. Carter nodded slowly as the descriptions matched his patient's. Your family is alive, he said simply, and Joseph's intake of breath was audible. Badly injured, deeply traumatized, but alive. They've been asking about a missing boy, wondering if you survived the attack. Tears flowed freely down Joseph's cheeks as he absorbed the news that his worst fears had not been realized. But Dr. Carter's next words sobered him quickly. However, they're also terrified. They believe Morrison is still hunting for survivors, and they're afraid to speak openly about what happened. Your mother keeps repeating one phrase, they will kill the boy if they find him. The weight of responsibility settled over the room, like a suffocating blanket. Joseph's survival wasn't just about his own life anymore. It was about protecting his family from further retaliation and potentially preventing a wider conflict between Apache communities and territorial authorities. Doctor, Sister Mary Catherine asked, in your professional opinion, what would happen if Joseph's testimony became public? If his story reached honest territorial officials? Dr. Carter considered the question carefully. If we could get his testimony to Governor Patterson in Phoenix, along with corroborating medical evidence from his family's injuries, it might be enough to launch a formal investigation. Patterson has a reputation for fairness, and he's been concerned about reports of corruption in rural law enforcement. But, Maggie asked, having entered the room during the conversation, but Morrison has powerful friends and substantial resources. He's also positioned himself as the primary expert on Apache threats in this region. Any investigation would take weeks or months to complete, and in the meantime, Dr. Carter didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. It was Joseph who proposed the solution that would define their next course of action. Doctor, you said my family is afraid to speak because they think I am dead? That's correct. And Morrison continues hunting me because he thinks I can expose his crimes? Yes. Joseph's eyes took on a determined gleam that reminded everyone present of his heritage as a warrior's son. Then we give Morrison what he wants. We let him think he has found me. The audacity of the plan took everyone's breath away. Sister Mary Catherine was the first to voice the obvious problem. Joseph, that's suicide. Morrison wants you dead, not captured. Not if I'm surrounded by witnesses, Joseph replied with growing conviction. Morrison's power comes from operating in shadows, attacking isolated victims who have no voice in white man's law. But what if his next encounter with Apache happens in front of doctor, priest, territorial officials? What if the dangerous fugitive he's been hunting turns out to be wounded boy seeking help from Christian charity? Dr. Carter's eyes lit up with understanding. You're talking about forcing Morrison into a public confrontation, where his actions will be witnessed and documented by credible white authorities. Exactly. But it has to be done carefully, with preparation and protection. Joseph turned to address the group. Doctor, can you arrange for territorial officials to be present? People who outrank Morrison and can override his authority. Possibly. There's a territorial judge, Judge William Morrison, no relation to the deputy, who's due to circuit through Prescott next week. If I could arrange for him to visit St. Catherine's on official business. Sister Mary Catherine began to see the possibilities, but also the enormous risks. We'd be gambling everything on the assumption that Morrison won't simply shoot first and fabricate justification later. That's why we need more than just official witnesses, Maggie interjected, her strategic mind working through the complexities. We need the entire community invested in Joseph's protection. Over the following days, Dr. Carter proved to be an invaluable ally in building their network of support. His medical reputation gave him access to influential people throughout the territory, and his growing outrage over Morrison's crimes motivated him to take unprecedented risks. First, he arranged for Judge Morrison to schedule an official inspection of St. Catherine's orphanage, ostensibly to ensure that territorial standards for child welfare were being maintained. The judge, unaware of the larger drama unfolding, agreed. To visit the following Monday. Second, Dr. Carter began carefully documenting the medical evidence of Morrison's crimes. He photographed the injuries of Joseph's family members, recorded their testimony under medical privilege, and compiled a formal report that could serve as evidence in any future legal proceedings. Most importantly, he began spreading Joseph's story among trusted colleagues and community leaders, always framing it in terms of moral obligation rather than political conflict. A wounded child had sought sanctuary at a Christian orphanage. What decent person could argue against providing medical care and protection? The response was more positive than any of them had dared hope. Father Valdez, when informed of the full situation, immediately offered the church's protection and promised to be present during Judge Morrison's visit. The local banker, Thomas Henderson, who had always respected Sister Mary Catherine's financial integrity, quietly let it be known that any official who caused trouble for St. Catherine's would find their credit standing in the community significantly damaged. Even more surprisingly, several of the ranchers whose cattle had allegedly been stolen, the thefts that Morrison had used to justify his raids, came forward with information that contradicted the deputy's reports. The missing cattle, it turned out, had mostly been found wandering after breaking through poorly maintained fences, or had been legitimately sold to pay debts that Morrison had failed to investigate. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the territorial governor's wife who was visiting Prescott to oversee the construction of a new school, learned of the situation through Dr. Carter's careful networking. Her reaction was immediate and forceful. "Doctor," she told him during a private dinner, "my husband has been concerned about reports of excessive force being used against peaceful Indian communities. If you're telling me that a territorial deputy has been conducting unauthorized military operations disguised as law enforcement, Governor Patterson needs to know immediately." By the end of the week, what had started as a desperate attempt to save one wounded boy had grown into a territorial scandal with implications reaching all the way to Phoenix. Morrison's network of corruption was being exposed piece by piece, and his position of unquestioned authority was crumbling. But power cornered is power at its most dangerous. Morrison had built his reputation and wealth on his ability to eliminate problems before they became threats. As word of the investigation reached his ears through his own network of informants, he began making plans for a final devastating solution. On Saturday afternoon, 2 days before Judge Morrison's scheduled visit, Morrison arrived in Prescott with a 12-man posse and emergency territorial authority to eliminate the Apache terrorist threat once and for all. The message reached St. Catherine's just as the sun was setting, carried by a breathless ranch hand who'd overheard Morrison's men talking in the saloon. The deputy wasn't planning to wait for official visits or judicial procedures. He was coming at dawn, with enough men and firepower to overwhelm any resistance. As night fell over St. Catherine's Home for Children, the small community prepared for what might be their final stand. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of approaching storms. Inside, an unlikely alliance of children, clergy, and concerned citizens gathered around a wounded Apache boy, determined to prove that justice could triumph over corruption, even in the lawless territories of the American frontier. The question was no longer whether they had the moral authority to protect Joseph. The community had answered that question definitively. The question now was whether they had the courage and ingenuity to survive what was coming at sunrise. Dawn came to St. Catherine's Home for Children, with an eerie stillness that seemed to press down on the desert like a held breath. The usual morning sounds, birds calling from the mesquite trees, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the canyon were conspicuously absent, as if nature itself was waiting for the confrontation that everyone knew was coming. Maggie stood at the window of the main dormitory, watching the eastern horizon for the first signs of dust clouds that would announce Morrison's arrival. Behind her, the other children were gathered in small groups, their usual morning routines abandoned in favor of nervous whispers and worried glances toward the storage room where Joseph waited with Sister Mary Catherine. "They're coming, Timothy," Fletcher said quietly, his young voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Over the past week, the boy who had initially been Joseph's most vocal opponent had become one of his staunchest defenders. "I can see the dust about 2 miles out." Dr. Carter, who had spent the night at St. Catherine's despite the obvious danger, moved to the window beside Maggie. His medical bag sat ready on a nearby table, prepared for whatever injuries the morning might bring. In his vest pocket, carefully sealed in an oilcloth envelope, were the photographs and medical testimony that could destroy Morrison's reputation if they survived long enough to present them. "How many riders?" Dr. Carter asked, adjusting his spectacles to better see the approaching cloud of dust. "Looks like at least 12, maybe more," Sarah Wilson reported from another window. At 14, she had appointed herself as the orphanage's unofficial lookout, her sharp eyes and steady nerves making her ideal for the task. Sister Mary Catherine emerged from the storage room, her face pale but determined. "Joseph is ready," she announced to the assembled group. "He understands what he needs to do." The plan they had developed was both simple and terrifyingly complex. When Morrison arrived, Joseph would present himself openly as a patient receiving medical care at the orphanage. Dr. Carter would document Morrison's response and demand that any official action go through proper territorial channels. The presence of the children, along with Father Valdez and the other community supporters who were expected to arrive shortly, would serve as both witnesses and moral shields against excessive violence. The success of the plan depended entirely on Morrison's unwillingness to commit mass murder in front of credible witnesses. It was, as Dr. Carter had grimly noted, a gamble with very high stakes. "Father Valdez isn't here yet," Maggie observed, scanning the empty road that led to town. "What if Morrison arrives before our other witnesses?" "Then we proceed anyway," Sister Mary Catherine replied firmly. "We've committed ourselves to this course, and backing down now would only delay the inevitable while making Morrison more suspicious." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls with an ominous rhythm that seemed to count down the seconds until confrontation. Through the windows they could now see individual riders, their horses lathered with sweat from hard travel, their weapons clearly visible even at distance. Deputy Morrison rode at the head of the group, his imposing figure unmistakable even among the other armed men. The yellow mustache and facial scar that Joseph had described were clearly visible as he drew closer, along with the cruel smile that seemed to be his permanent expression when anticipating violence. "Positions, everyone," Sister Mary Catherine sighed quietly. "Remember, we are a Christian orphanage going about our normal morning routine. We have nothing to hide and everything to be proud of." The children scattered to their assigned locations, some in the kitchen preparing breakfast, others in the classroom setting up for morning lessons, all maintaining the illusion of normalcy while staying within sight and hearing of the main courtyard where the Confrontation would take place. Morrison and his men thundered into the orphanage grounds with the dramatic flair of men accustomed to intimidating their opponents through sheer display of force. They reined in their horses in a loose semicircle around the main building, kicking up clouds of dust that settled over everything like a brown shroud. "Sister Mary Catherine." Morrison's voice boomed across the courtyard with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I have reason to believe you're harboring a dangerous fugitive. By order of the territorial government, I'm here to conduct a search of these premises." Sister Mary Catherine stepped out onto the front porch, her white habit spotless despite the tension of the morning, her bearing calm and dignified. "Deputy Morrison, you're welcome to search St. Catherine's, but I must insist that any official action be conducted according to proper procedures. Do you have a warrant?" Morrison's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Sister, when dealing with Apache terrorists, territorial emergency powers supersede normal judicial requirements. I don't need a warrant to protect decent white folks from savage killers." "I see," Sister Mary Catherine replied evenly. "And who exactly are you seeking to protect us from?" Before Morrison could answer, Dr. Carter stepped out of the building behind Sister Mary Catherine, his medical bag in one hand and a official-looking document in the other. "Deputy Morrison, I'm Dr. Benjamin Carter, Territorial Medical Examiner. I must inform you that this facility is currently under medical quarantine due to an infectious patient. Any search would need to be authorized by territorial health authorities." Morrison's eyes narrowed dangerously as he recognized the doctor. Dr. Carter's reputation for integrity made him a significant threat to Morrison's plans, and his presence here was definitely not a coincidence. "Doctor," Morrison said with false courtesy, "I appreciate your concern for public health, but territorial security takes precedence over medical protocol. If you're harboring the Apache terrorist I'm hunting, no amount of medical mumbo-jumbo is going to protect you." "Apache terrorist?" Dr. Carter asked with apparent confusion. "Deputy, the only Apache person currently at St. Catherine's is a wounded child who sought medical attention. Are you telling me that providing medical care to injured children is now considered harboring terrorists?" The exchange was being watched carefully by Morrison's men, several of whom were beginning to look uncomfortable with the situation. They had signed up to hunt dangerous criminals, not to threaten doctors and nuns who were caring for sick children. "Bring him out," Morrison demanded, his hand moving to rest on his pistol grip. "Bring out this wounded child, and let me see for myself whether he's as innocent as you claim." This was the moment they had all been preparing for. Sister Mary Catherine nodded toward the building, and Joseph Crow Feather emerged, walking slowly due to his still healing leg wound, dressed in the simple clothes of an orphaned child rather than traditional Apache garments. The effect on Morrison was immediate and dramatic. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, recognition, rage, and finally a cold calculation that was somehow more frightening than his obvious anger. "Well, well," Morrison said softly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard, "the missing piece of my puzzle. Joseph Crow Feather, you've led me quite a chase, boy." Joseph stood straight despite his physical limitations, meeting Morrison's gaze with a courage that impressed even his enemies. "Deputy Morrison," he said in clear English, "I am Joseph Crow Feather, and I accuse you of murder, theft, and crimes against my people." The formal accusation, delivered in front of witnesses with the dignity of a tribal elder despite Joseph's youth, sent a ripple of shock through Morrison's men. This wasn't the savage killer they'd been told they were hunting. This was an articulate boy making specific legal accusations against their leader. Morrison's response was swift and vicious. He drew his pistol and pointed it directly at Joseph's chest. "You little savage, you have no right to accuse anyone of anything. You're a terrorist and a murderer, and territorial law gives me full authority to execute you on sight." "On what evidence?" Dr. Carter demanded, stepping protectively closer to Joseph. "This boy has been under medical care for a week. During that time, he has committed no crimes and threatened no one. If you shoot an unarmed child in front of witnesses, you'll be the one facing murder charges." Several of Morrison's men exchanged uncomfortable glances. The situation was becoming far more complex than they had been led to believe, and the presence of respected community figures like Dr. Carter was making their usual tactics impossible to justify. It was at that moment that salvation arrived from an unexpected direction. The sound of additional hoofbeats announced the arrival of Father Valdez, but he wasn't alone. Riding beside him was a distinguished older man in a black suit whose bearing marked him as someone of considerable authority. "Deputy Morrison," the older man called out as he dismounted. "I'm Judge William Morrison, Territorial Circuit Court. I understand there's some kind of emergency situation here that requires judicial oversight." The arrival of a territorial judge changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Morrison could intimidate nuns and doctors, but he couldn't simply ignore the direct representative of territorial legal authority, especially one who shared his surname and might take personal offense at any damage to the Morrison family reputation. "Your Honor," Morrison said, quickly holstering his weapon and attempting to regain his composure, "I'm pursuing a dangerous Apache fugitive who has been hiding at this orphanage. The situation requires immediate action to protect public safety." "Judge." Morrison looked around the courtyard, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating complex legal situations. His gaze lingered on Joseph, noting the boy's obvious youth and medical condition, then moved to assess the credibility of the various witnesses present. "I see," Judge Morrison said thoughtfully. "And what specific crimes is this young man accused of committing?" Deputy Morrison launched into a litany of charges: murder, arson, cattle theft, terrorism, but his presentation was hurried and defensive rather than authoritative. Judge Morrison listened patiently, occasionally asking for specific details that the deputy seemed unable to provide. "These are serious accusations," Judge Morrison observed when the deputy finished his recitation. "I assume you have substantial evidence to support them?" "The evidence is his presence here, Your Honor. Apache don't belong in white settlements unless they're up to no good." The racist assumption, stated so baldly in front of a territorial judge, caused several of Morrison's own men to wince. Judge Morrison's expression grew distinctly cooler. "Deputy, territorial law does not recognize ethnic identity as evidence of criminal behavior. If you wish to arrest this young man, you'll need to present actual evidence of specific crimes." Dr. Carter seized the opportunity to present his own evidence. "Your Honor, if I may, I have medical documentation that contradicts Deputy Morrison's characterization of recent events in this region." He withdrew the envelope containing photographs and testimony from Joseph's family members, handing it directly to Judge Morrison. As the judge examined the evidence, his expression grew increasingly grim. "Deputy Morrison," Judge Morrison said finally, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, "these medical records suggest that Apache families in this region have been victims of violence, not perpetrators. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Morrison's composure finally cracked completely. Faced with evidence that contradicted his carefully constructed narrative, trapped between his own men's growing doubts and a territorial judge's scrutiny, he made the desperate choice that would define the rest of his life. "Your Honor," Morrison snarled, his hand moving back toward his weapon. "Sometimes judges need to understand that frontier justice operates by different rules than courtroom law." The threat was unmistakable, and it crossed a line that even Morrison's most loyal followers couldn't ignore. Several of his men immediately distanced themselves, literally backing their horses away from their leader as they realized he was threatening a territorial judge. "Deputy Morrison," Judge Morrison said with icy calm, "you are relieved of your authority effective immediately." Surrender your badge and weapons to Dr. Carter, and consider yourself under arrest for threatening a judicial officer. Morrison's response was to draw his pistol, but he never got the chance to use it. Timothy Fletcher, the 8-year-old boy who had lost his parents to Apache raiders, threw himself at Morrison's horse with a courage that stunned everyone present. "You killed Joseph's family just like raiders killed mine," Timothy screamed, grabbing at Morrison's leg with desperate strength. "You're the same kind of evil." The unexpected attack from a child disrupted Morrison's aim long enough for Dr. Carter to tackle him from the other side. Within seconds, the courtyard erupted into chaos as Morrison's men chose sides, some remaining loyal to their corrupt leader, others throwing their support behind the territorial judge and the evidence of Morrison's crimes. When the dust settled, Morrison lay unconscious in the dirt, disarmed and defeated. 3 of his men had fled toward the mountains, but the rest had surrendered to Judge Morrison's authority. The confrontation that had threatened to become a massacre had instead become a moment of justice finally served. But even as they celebrated their victory, everyone present understood that this was only the beginning. Morrison's network of corruption extended far beyond one corrupt deputy, and his crimes against Apache communities represented a pattern of injustice that would take years to fully address. The real test would be whether the courage shown by a wounded Apache boy and an Irish orphan girl could inspire lasting change in a territory where prejudice and violence had ruled for too long. The defeat of Deputy Morrison might have been the end of the story in a simpler world, but the Arizona Territory of 1887 was far from simple. Within hours of Morrison's arrest, the full scope of the corruption network he had built became clear, and the forces arrayed against justice proved to be far more extensive and dangerous than anyone had imagined. Judge William Morrison had barely finished securing the corrupt deputy's weapons when a new dust cloud appeared on the horizon, this one larger and more ominous than Morrison's morning raid. As the riders drew closer, it became apparent that they wore the blue uniforms of the U.S. Cavalry, led by a colonel whose bearing suggested he was accustomed to having his orders followed without question. Judge Morrison, Colonel Harrison Blackwood, called out as he dismounted, the same man Joseph had identified as the corrupt Indian agent who had orchestrated the theft of Apache settlement lands. "I understand there's been some kind of misunderstanding regarding Deputy Morrison's law enforcement activities." The pieces of the larger conspiracy began falling into place with sickening clarity. Morrison hadn't been operating alone. He'd been part of a systematic effort to drive Apache peoples off valuable land, with military and civilian authorities working together to legitimize what amounted to organized theft and murder. Judge Morrison, however, was not a man easily intimidated, even by military authority. "Colonel Blackwood, there's been no misunderstanding. Deputy Morrison has been arrested for threatening a territorial judge and for presenting fraudulent evidence in what appears to be a conspiracy to commit crimes against Apache communities." Colonel Blackwood's smile was cold and calculating. "Judge, I'm afraid you've been misinformed about the situation. Deputy Morrison was operating under special military authority to combat Apache terrorism. His actions, while perhaps appearing harsh to civilian observers, were entirely within his legal mandate." Dr. Carter stepped forward with the envelope containing medical evidence. "Colonel, I have documented proof that Morrison's alleged Apache terrorists were actually peaceful families living on legally designated land. The injuries I've documented are consistent with torture, not combat." "Doctor," Colonel Blackwood replied dismissively, "I appreciate your medical expertise, but you lack the military experience to distinguish between legitimate combat injuries and the unfortunate casualties that occur when savage peoples resist lawful authority." The colonel's casual dismissal of documented evidence and his racist characterization of Apache peoples revealed the depth of institutional corruption they were facing. This wasn't just about one corrupt deputy. It was about a systematic effort to dehumanize Apache communities in order to justify their destruction. Joseph, who had been listening to the exchange with growing anger, stepped forward despite Sister Mary Catherine's protective gesture. "Colonel Blackwood, you are the man who stole our legal papers and claimed Agent Wheeler's agreements were invalid." Colonel Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he recognized the boy he had thought was safely dead. So the little witness survived after all. How inconvenient. The casual admission of knowledge about Morrison's attempted murder sent a chill through the assembled witnesses. Colonel Blackwood wasn't even bothering to maintain the pretense of legitimate law enforcement. He was openly acknowledging his role in the conspiracy. "Colonel," Judge Morrison said sharply, "are you admitting knowledge of criminal activities?" "I'm acknowledging reality, Judge. The Apache settlement program was a failed experiment that threatened territorial security. Removing the participants was a military necessity, not a criminal act." Father Valdez, who had remained silent during the initial confrontation, finally spoke up. "Colonel, as a representative of the Catholic Church, I must protest your characterization of families seeking peaceful coexistence as threats to security." "Father, the Church's role is spiritual guidance, not territorial policy," Colonel Blackwood replied curtly. "I suggest you confine your concerns to matters of salvation rather than military strategy." The colonel's dismissive tone toward a respected religious authority was another tactical error that further eroded his position with the assembled witnesses. But his next action revealed just how desperate and dangerous the situation had become. "Sergeant Williams," Colonel Blackwood called to one of his subordinates, "place Judge Morrison under military detention for interfering with authorized counter-terrorism operations." The order was so obviously illegal that even Colonel Blackwood's own soldiers hesitated. Arresting a territorial judge without evidence of federal crimes was beyond questionable. It was a direct assault on the constitutional separation of powers. "Sir," Sergeant Williams said uncertainly, "are you certain we have authority to detain a territorial judge?" "Sergeant, in matters of territorial security, military authority supersedes civilian jurisdiction," Colonel Blackwood replied with growing impatience. "Carry out your orders." But before Sergeant Williams could respond, a new voice cut across the courtyard with the authority of ultimate territorial power. "Colonel Blackwood, you will stand down immediately." Everyone turned to see Governor Matthew Patterson himself riding into the courtyard, accompanied by a small escort of territorial marshals. His presence was so unexpected that for a moment, even Colonel Blackwood seemed stunned into silence. Governor Patterson was a man in his 60s, with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone who had built his political career on personal integrity, rather than backroom deals. His reputation for fairness and his commitment to territorial law had made him many enemies among those who preferred the old frontier ways of settling disputes. "Governor Patterson," Colonel Blackwood recovered quickly, "what brings you to this remote location?" "Your wife, Colonel, Mrs. Patterson received a telegram from Dr. Carter yesterday evening describing serious allegations of military misconduct in this region. When she shared those concerns with me, I decided to investigate personally." "Governor." Patterson dismounted and surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a politician who had learned to assess complex situations quickly. His gaze lingered on the arrested Morrison, the uncomfortable soldiers, and the group of civilians who were clearly the center of the controversy. "Dr. Carter," Governor Patterson said, "I understand you have medical evidence of crimes committed against Apache families." Dr. Carter immediately presented his documentation to the governor, who examined it with the careful attention of someone trained in legal evaluation. As he read, Governor Patterson's expression grew increasingly grim. "Judge Morrison," the governor said finally, "what is your assessment of the situation from a legal standpoint?" "Governor, based on the evidence Dr. Carter has presented and the testimony I've heard from witnesses, it appears that Deputy Morrison has been conducting unauthorized Military operations against peaceful Apache communities. Colonel Blackwood has now threatened to arrest me for investigating these activities. Governor Patterson turned to face Colonel Blackwood directly. Colonel, under what authority did you order military action against Apache settlers who were living on legally designated land? Governor, the Apache settlement program was a territorial security risk that required military intervention. Colonel Blackwood replied, but his confidence was clearly shaking in the face of gubernatorial scrutiny. That's not what I asked, Colonel. I asked under what specific legal authority you ordered military action. The Apache settlement program was established by federal treaty and territorial law. Terminating it would require federal authorization, which I know was never granted. The governor's detailed knowledge of the legal framework surrounding Apache settlements revealed that Colonel Blackwood's claims of legitimate authority were completely fabricated. The colonel had been operating entirely outside his legal mandate, using military resources for personal and political gain. Joseph seized the moment to present his testimony directly to the highest territorial authority. Governor Patterson, Colonel Blackwood and Deputy Morrison murdered my grandfather, burned our homes, and planned to kill all the survivors to steal our land. The formal accusation, delivered by a young Apache boy to the territorial governor in front of multiple witnesses, carried a moral weight that transcended legal technicalities. Governor Patterson looked at Joseph with the same attention he would give to any citizen presenting grievances to their elected representative. Son, those are serious accusations. Are you prepared to testify under oath about what you witnessed? Yes, sir. I am prepared to tell the truth about what these men did to my people. Governor Patterson nodded solemnly, then turned to address Colonel Blackwood with the full authority of territorial government behind his words. Colonel Blackwood, you are hereby relieved of command pending a full federal investigation into your conduct. Deputy Morrison will be transferred to territorial custody to face charges of murder, theft, and conspiracy. Any military personnel who participated in unauthorized operations against Apache settlements will be subject to court-martial proceedings. Colonel Blackwood's face flushed red with rage and desperation. Like Morrison before him, he was cornered and facing the complete destruction of his career and freedom. His response was swift and predictable. Governor, you're making a serious mistake. The men who support me control substantial resources and have connections throughout the territorial government. Opposing us will cost you more than you can afford. The threat was unmistakable, and it revealed the extent of the corruption network that had been operating in Arizona territory. But Governor Patterson had not built his political career by backing down from powerful interests when justice was at stake. Colonel, are you threatening an elected territorial governor in front of witnesses? Before Colonel Blackwood could respond, the situation took an unexpected turn that would determine the final outcome of the entire conflict. Apache war cry echoed across the desert, followed by the thunder of dozens of horses approaching at full gallop. Chief Gray Wolf, Joseph's great-uncle, crested the ridge overlooking St. Catharines with nearly 200 Apache warriors behind him. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying, a living embodiment of the frontier's worst nightmares, but also its most noble possibilities. The warriors spread out in a perfect line along the ridge, their weapons visible but not raised in immediate threat. Chief Gray Wolf rode down into the courtyard alone, his bearing dignified and peaceful despite the overwhelming force at his command. I am Gray Wolf of the Chiricahua Apache, he announced in clear English. I come seeking my brother's grandson, Joseph Crowfeather, who was taken by bad white men. Governor Patterson, demonstrating the political courage that had earned him respect throughout the territory, stepped forward to address the Apache chief directly. Chief Gray Wolf, Joseph Crowfeather is safe and under the protection of territorial law. The men who harmed his family are being arrested and will face justice. Chief Gray Volf's eyes found Joseph among the assembled witnesses, and the relief that crossed the older man's features was visible even to those who didn't share his cultural background. "My nephew lives," Chief Gray Wolf said simply. "This is good. But what of justice for my brother's blood? What of the land that was stolen, the sacred places that were burned?" The question hung in the desert air like a challenge that would define the future relationship between Apache peoples and territorial government. Governor Patterson understood that his answer would determine whether the 200 warriors on the ridge remained peaceful or became the spearhead of a territorial war. "Chief Gray Wolf," Governor Patterson said carefully, "territorial law requires that crimes be investigated and punished according to legal procedures. I give you my word that the men responsible for attacking your family will face full justice. Under territorial and federal law, and our stolen land, our right to live in peace, will be restored according to the original agreements made with Agent Wheeler. Any future changes to Apache settlement rights will be negotiated through proper legal channels with full tribal representation." Chief Gray Wolf studied the governor's face for a long moment, weighing the sincerity of promises that Apache peoples had heard broken many times before. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Margaret Sullivan," Chief Gray Wolf said, turning to address Maggie directly, red-haired girl who saved my nephew's life. "Apache people do not forget such kindness." The formal acknowledgement from an Apache chief carried tremendous weight in frontier society. Maggie found herself at the center of a moment that would be remembered and retold for generations. A young Irish orphan being honored by Apache warriors for choosing compassion over fear. As Chief Gray Wolf and his warriors prepared to depart, taking Joseph with them for a joyful reunion with his surviving family members, the full implications of the day's events began to settle over the assembled witnesses. Morrison and Blackwood's conspiracy had been exposed and defeated, but more importantly, a new model for Apache-white relations had been demonstrated. Justice delivered through legal channels rather than violence. Conflicts resolved through courage and truth-telling rather than suppression and denial. The battle for Joseph Crowfeather's life had become a battle for the soul of the Arizona Territory itself. And in the end, it was won not by the strongest or most ruthless, but by those who chose to see their shared humanity across cultural and racial divides. 3 months had passed since the confrontation that changed everything at St. Catherine's Home for Children. The Arizona winter had settled over the desert with its deceptive gentleness, cool mornings that gave way to warm afternoons, and nights clear enough to count every star in the vast sky. But the most profound changes weren't in the weather. They were in the hearts and minds of people throughout the territory. Maggie Sullivan stood at the newly constructed gate of St. Catherine's, watching the horizon with the same attention she'd once reserved for scanning the desert for danger. But now she was looking for friends, not threats. The wooden sign beside her, carved by Timothy Fletcher during his woodworking lessons, read, "St. Catherine's Home for All Children, where every heart finds family." The expansion had been Governor Patterson's idea, implemented with unprecedented territorial funding and support from an unlikely coalition of donors. What had started as a small orphanage for displaced white children had become something entirely new, a model community where Apache, Mexican, and white children learned together, played together, and discovered that the differences their parents had fought over were far less important than the similarities they shared. "Maggie!" Timothy Fletcher called out as he came running from the new dormitory building. At 9 years old, he had grown taller and stronger, but more importantly, he had grown wiser. The hatred that had once consumed him had been replaced by something far more powerful, the kind of understanding that comes from living alongside people you once feared. "Joseph's family is coming up the road," Timothy announced breathlessly. "And they're not alone. Looks like half the settlement is with them." Maggie smiled at Timothy's excitement. The weekly visits from Joseph's reunited family had become one of the highlights of life at St. Catherine's, but today was special. Today marked exactly 3 months since Joseph had walked out of their storage room and into a new life, and his extended Apache community was coming to participate in a ceremony that would formalize the bonds that had grown between two very different peoples. Sister Mary Catherine emerged from the main building, her face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had seen her life's work evolve beyond her wildest dreams. The past 3 months had been challenging. Integrating children from different cultures required patience, creativity, and frequent diplomatic intervention, but the results had exceeded everyone's expectations. "Are you ready for this, Maggie?" Sister Mary Catherine asked, adjusting the special ceremonial sash that Apache women had woven for the occasion. The intricate beadwork told the story of a red-haired girl who had chosen compassion over fear, changing the course of history through a simple act of kindness. "I think so," Maggie replied, though her stomach fluttered with nervous excitement. "Sister, do you really think this ceremony is necessary? I just did what anyone would have done." Sister Mary Catherine's smile was gentle but firm. "Maggie, what you did was exactly what anyone should do, but very few people have the courage to actually do it. The Apache people understand the significance of your choice in ways that we're only beginning to appreciate." The sound of approaching riders grew louder, and soon the delegation from the Apache settlement came into view. Joseph rode at the front, beside his father, Standing Elk, who had recovered from his injuries with the care of both Apache medicine men and Dr. Carter's modern medical techniques. Behind them rode Blue Morning Star, Joseph's mother, who had initially been too traumatized to speak, but had gradually regained her strength and voice through the healing process. But it wasn't just Joseph's immediate family making the journey. Chief Gray Wolf rode with them, along with dozens of other Apache families who had helped establish the new settlement that had risen from the ashes of Morrison's destruction. Following territorial law and with Governor Patterson's direct support, they had reclaimed their legal lands and built something even stronger than what had been destroyed. As the Apache delegation approached the gate, children from St. Catherine's came streaming out of buildings and classrooms to greet their visitors. The sight that would have terrified frontier communities just months earlier, dozens of Apache riders approaching a settlement of white children, now brought smiles and excited waves from youngsters who saw friends and teachers rather than threats. "Joseph," called out Maria Santos, a Mexican girl whose parents had died in a cholera outbreak and who had found refuge at St. Catherine's. She ran toward Joseph's horse with the fearless enthusiasm of a 7-year-old who had never learned to see skin. Color as a barrier to friendship, Joseph dismounted and caught Maria in a gentle hug, his own face bright with the joy of reunion. Over the past 3 months, he had become something unprecedented in Arizona territory, a bridge between worlds, equally comfortable in Apache traditions and white settlements, speaking both languages fluently and carrying the respect of both communities. "Maria, you've grown so tall," Joseph said in Spanish, demonstrating the linguistic skills that had made him invaluable as a translator and cultural mediator. "Are you still the fastest runner at St. Catherine's?" "Race me and find out," Maria challenged. But their competition was interrupted by the arrival of other children, eager to greet their Apache friends and teachers. Chief Gray Wolf dismounted with the dignity appropriate to his age and status, but his eyes sought out Maggie with unmistakable warmth. Over the past 3 months, he had come to regard the Irish Orphan as an honorary member of his extended family, and today's ceremony would make that relationship official in ways that transcended cultural boundaries. "Red hair who sees truth," Chief Gray Wolf said, using the Apache name the community had given to Maggie. "Are you prepared for the honor that waits for you?" Maggie nodded, though she still didn't fully understand the scope of what the Apache community had planned. Chief Gray Wolf had been deliberately mysterious about the details, saying only that the ceremony would acknowledge her role in preventing a war and establishing a new model for peace between peoples. Dr. Carter, arrived from Prescott just as the Apache delegation was settling their horses, his medical bag supplemented by a carefully wrapped package that he handled with obvious reverence. His role in the events that had transformed the territory had earned him honorary membership in the Apache community, and he now served as the primary liaison between Apache healing traditions and modern medical practice. "Maggie," Dr. Carter sighed, presenting her with the wrapped package. "Chief Gray Wolf asked me to bring this for today's ceremony. It belonged to Joseph's grandfather, Running Bear, and carrying it will show the Apache community that you understand the responsibility that comes with the honor they're giving you." Maggie unwrapped the package to reveal a staff carved from oak and decorated with eagle feathers, turquoise beads, and silver bands that caught the afternoon sunlight like captured sky. The craftsmanship was exquisite, but more important than its beauty was what it represented: the authority and responsibility of someone chosen to speak for peace between hostile peoples. "I can't accept this," Maggie said, overwhelmed by the significance of the gift. "I'm just a 12-year-old orphan. I'm not wise enough or important enough to carry something this sacred." Standing Elk, who had been listening to the conversation with his growing command of English, stepped forward to address Maggie directly. "Red Hair who sees truth, wisdom is not measured by years lived, but by choices made. When you chose to help my son instead of fearing him, you showed the wisdom that many adults lack." Blue Morning Star approached and took Maggie's hands gently, speaking in Apache before Joseph translated her words. "My mother says that the spirits guided you to my hiding place, just as they guided our ancestors to water in the desert. She says you are young in years, but old in the soul, and the staff belongs with someone who will use it to protect all children, not just Apache children." The ceremony itself began as the sun reached its highest point, symbolizing the moment when shadows disappear and all things are seen clearly. Chief Gray Wolf had explained that this was the traditional time for making promises that would bind different peoples together in friendship and mutual protection. The entire community of St. Catherine's gathered in the expanded courtyard, now large enough to accommodate not just the resident children, but also the Apache families and the growing number of territorial officials who had come to witness this unprecedented event. Governor Patterson had arrived with his wife Eleanor, both of them understanding that they were participating in something that could define the future of the territory. Judge William Morrison stood ready to provide legal framework for agreements that transcended traditional tribal and territorial boundaries. Father Valdez had prepared special blessings that honored both Christian and Apache spiritual traditions. Even some of the reformed members of Morrison's original posse had come, men who had realized the extent to which they'd been deceived and who now sought to make amends through support for the new model of coexistence. Chief Gray Wolf began the ceremony by lighting a sacred fire in the center of the courtyard, using traditional Apache techniques that created sweet-smelling smoke from carefully selected desert woods. As the smoke rose toward the clear sky, he spoke in Apache, with Joseph translating for the mixed audience. "My grandfather taught me that when different peoples meet, they can choose to see enemies or relatives. For too many seasons, fear has chosen for us, making enemies where relatives should have been. But Red Hair who sees truth chose differently. She chose to see a wounded boy, not a dangerous enemy. She chose to see a person in need, not a threat to be destroyed." Chief Gray Wolf gestured for Maggie to step forward, and she moved nervously into the circle around the sacred fire, still carrying Running Bear's ceremonial staff. The weight of it in her hands felt like the weight of history itself, generations of conflict and misunderstanding that could be transformed through the choices made by young people brave enough to see beyond inherited prejudices. "Red Hair who sees truth," Chief Gray Wolf continued. "The Apache people name you sister to all tribes, protector of children, bridge between worlds. These are not just words. They are responsibilities that will follow you all your life. Do you accept these responsibilities?" Maggie looked around the circle of faces, Apache children who had learned English alongside white children who had learned Apache phrases, Mexican families who had found refuge in the expanded orphanage, territorial officials who had chosen justice over political convenience. All of them watching her, waiting for her answer to a question that would help determine the future of the Arizona Territory. "I accept," Maggie said, her young voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "But I can't carry these responsibilities alone. It will take all of us working together to make sure that children like Joseph never have to suffer what he suffered." Chief Gray Wolf nodded approvingly, then made a gesture that brought gasps of amazement from the assembled crowd. From the ridge surrounding St. Catherine's, Apache warriors began to appear, not dozens, but hundreds. They came silently, respectfully, taking positions along the high ground that overlooked the orphanage. 200 warriors of the Apache people, Chief Gray Wolf announced, come to honor Red Hair who sees truth and to promise protection for all children who learn the ways of peace at this place. The sight was magnificent and humbling hundreds of Apache warriors, armed and mounted, choosing to kneel their horses in a gesture of respect for a 12-year-old Irish orphan, who had shown them that not all white people were their enemies. The symbolism was unmistakable, the same Apache fighting force that could have destroyed every white settlement in the territory was instead pledging protection for a place where Apache and white children learned to be friends. Governor Patterson, understanding the historic significance of the moment, stepped forward to make his own ceremonial commitment. "By the authority of the Arizona Territorial Government, I hereby declare St. Catherine's home for all children to be under permanent territorial protection. Any person or group that threatens this place or the children it shelters will face the full force of territorial law." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Maggie found herself standing beside Joseph at the gate where everything had begun. The storage room where he had recovered from his wounds had been converted into a library where Apache and white children learned each other's languages and stories. The courtyard where Morrison had made his threats was now a playground where children of all backgrounds played games that mixed traditions from different cultures. "Joseph," Maggie said quietly, "do you think it will last, this peace we've built?" Joseph considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. At 14, he had seen more violence and hatred than most adults, but he had also experienced the transformative power of compassion and understanding. "I think it will last as long as we remember that peace is not something you achieve once and keep forever," he replied thoughtfully. "Peace is something you choose every day, in every interaction with someone who is different from you. And as long as there are people like you willing to make that choice, there will always be hope." As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Maggie looked out over the expanded community that had grown from a single act of compassion. Apache children and white children played together in the courtyard. Teenage students worked side by side in gardens where both corn and traditional desert plants grew in carefully planned harmony. Adults from different cultures shared evening meals and discussed problems that affected all their communities. It wasn't perfect. There were still misunderstandings, still moments of tension, still people on all sides who preferred the old ways of hatred and suspicion. But it was a beginning, a demonstration that another way was possible. Sister Mary Catherine joined Maggie at the gate, both of them watching the peaceful scene with satisfaction and hope. "Maggie," Sister Mary Catherine said softly, "Martha's books taught us that education is something no one can take away from you once you have it. But what you've helped create here is something even more valuable, proof that hatred can be transformed into love, that fear can become friendship, that the things that divide us are less important than the things that unite us." As the first stars appeared in the desert sky, Maggie realized that her journey from a frightened orphan to a bridge between worlds was far from over. There would be other wounded creatures to help, other misunderstandings to heal, other opportunities to choose compassion over fear. But for tonight, it was enough to stand at the gate of St. Catherine's Home for All Children, surrounded by friends who had once been strangers, protected by warriors who had once been enemies, and filled with the knowledge that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can transform the world. The little orphan who had helped a wounded Apache boy had become something she'd never imagined, a symbol of hope for an entire territory. Living proof that the future could be different from the past if enough people had the courage to choose love over fear. And somewhere in the distance, across the desert that had once divided peoples, other communities were beginning to ask themselves, if children can learn to see past their differences, why can't adults do the same? The answer to that question would shape the future of not just Arizona territory, but of a young nation still learning what it meant to be truly united. Asterisk, up next. You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.